The news anchor said they were about to play the 911 call one more time. For context, Abel Ferris had heard it 4 times already that month. He set down his coffee anyway. 12 seconds in, something in his chest went cold, not because of what the voice said, because of the half-breath the man took before saying it. A man who has been blind for 11 years learns that people breathe differently when they are lying. He learns it the way other people learn faces. Beside his chair, Juno lifted her head a moment later. She had heard it too. But Abel had heard it first. He's down at the corner of Bell and 9th. He's not moving. Send somebody. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled at that hour, coffee going cool in the cup, and underneath it, a thin metal note off the spoon he'd left resting against the rim. The television in the other room hissed at the edges of its own volume, the way old speakers do when the anchor's voice climbs. Abel sat with his hands flat on the table and let the report run its course. 2 years since Sergeant Farrow died on a corner in this town, 1 man convicted. The tape played again, for context. He was 47, blind 11 of those years, since a stretch of road outside Kandahar decided, in half a second, what the rest of his life would sound like instead of look like. He lived alone. 3 weeks ago, a woman from a program he'd barely trusted had walked a dog into his house and told him her name was Juno, 7 years old, County K9. Working years ended when her partner died, and nobody quite knew what to do with her after that. Abel hadn't asked what happened to the partner. 11 years had taught him not to ask questions whose answers he couldn't verify with his own hands. That habit was the first thing that argued with him now. 11 years of being led. A stranger's hand under his elbow at a crosswalk. Being told the light was green before he could trust it was. Nodding along because disagreeing meant someone would ask, gently, how he could possibly know. He had learned to doubt his own ears before anyone else got the chance. So when the anchor's voice thinned back into traffic and the room went quiet, Abel did what he always did when he doubted himself. He checked the evidence twice. He played the 12 seconds back. Not the words, he had those word for word already. He played the half-breath, the little catch of air a man takes before committing to a sentence he's already decided to say. He'd heard that same catch from men about to lie to their commanding officers. He'd heard it once from a nurse before she told him a surgery hadn't gone the way they'd hoped. Not fear. Fear breathes ragged. This was rehearsed. A man loading a line he'd already written. He ran it again, a 3rd time, a 4th. The tape didn't change. Neither did the cold place in his chest. The dispatcher's voice on the recording was calm, in the way of someone reading from a page, not in the way of someone standing over a body in the dark, trying not to fall apart. Abel had been in exactly one kind of room where men spoke with that calm, under that weight, and it wasn't a phone booth. It was a hospital corridor, after. He reached down without deciding to, and found Juno's head already near his hand, as if she'd been waiting for the reach. "Girl," he said, out loud, into the empty kitchen, because there was no one else to hear him say it. "You heard that too, didn't you?" She only set her chin on the top of his foot, the whole warm weight of her jaw, a small huff of breath through her nose, stirring the hair on his ankle, and stayed there, still, the way she stood on street corners at night, for reasons he hadn't asked about yet. A cold thread of air found its way under the door and ran across his bare feet. The refrigerator ticked into its cycle down the hall. Ordinary sounds of a life that, 3 weeks in, felt like his own again. Abel sat with his coffee gone cold and understood, without wanting to, that he now carried something he had no way to prove and no one he could safely say it to. He was a blind man who had listened to a recording the whole country believed it already understood, and he had heard something underneath it that nobody else was listening for. The only one in the house who agreed with him couldn't speak a word of it. Rowan Prescott arrived so easily that nobody noticed him arriving, which was, Abel would come to understand much later, exactly the point. He knocked twice, waited the polite length of time, and let himself in when Abel called out that the door was open. He smelled of old cigarettes worn into the fabric of a jacket, with a thin skin of peppermint laid over the top of it, mint laid on deliberately, the way a man covers one thing by offering you another. He offered to drive Abel to the market, and then, once they were in the car, to read through the stack of mail that had been sitting unopened on the counter, because Abel's reader app kept mangling the county's official letterhead. "Anything urgent?" Abel asked. "Nothing that can't wait," Prescott said, and Abel noticed, filed it away without deciding to, that Prescott's voice slowed down on one particular line before he read it aloud, the way a man's voice slows when he is deciding, mid-sentence, how much of the truth to give you. "I'll take care of the paperwork side of things for you," Prescott offered, somewhere between the second and third envelope. "No sense you fighting with all that." Abel said thank you, because it was, on its face, a kind thing to say. It was only afterward, replaying the drive the way he replayed everything now, that he noticed Prescott had asked him a question early on, very lightly, almost buried under small talk about the weather. "You were listening to that broadcast this morning. Not had you seen it, not did you hear about it. Listening." Abel hadn't thought anything of it at the time. He thought about it now, turning the word over the way he turned over everything these days, testing it for a weight it hadn't seemed to carry the first time around. Prescott drove carefully, kept the radio low, asked after Abel's knee and whether the new dog was settling in, the kind of ordinary questions a genuinely kind man might ask. That was what made the memory of it, later, so hard to sit with. None of it had felt wrong in the moment. It had felt like being taken care of. The county's dog rehoming coordinator, a woman named Priya Nakamura, came by that same afternoon for what she called a routine check-in, though her voice had the flat, pre-decided quality of someone who had already written her conclusion before she rang the bell. She read from a folder, pages turning with a crisp official sound, bolted from her post 3 times in the last quarter, damaged exterior door hardware, twice, returns nightly to the same fixed location regardless of weather or handler instruction. "We use the word unstable," Priya said, "for dogs with a pattern like this." "Unstable," Abel repeated. "Or on duty?" The silence that followed lasted only 2 or 3 seconds, but Abel had spent 11 years learning what silences meant when he could no longer see the face that made them, and this one had weight to it. Priya did not answer him. She closed the folder instead, and the small click of the metal clasp told him more than her voice had all afternoon. She said, before she left, that if Juno left her post one more time, the program would have grounds to reclaim her. Abel heard the door close, heard Priya's car start in the driveway, and stood a long moment in his own kitchen with his hand resting on the back of a chair, absorbing the shape of a threat that had a name and a clock on it now. Juno left the house at 9 that night, same as she had every night for 3 weeks. Abel heard the back latch give, a small, precise click, the sound of a dog who had learned exactly how much pressure a door needed, and then the quick tap of her claws crossing the yard, fading into the wider dark. He stood on the porch and did not follow. He told himself it was because he didn't know the way. He knew, standing there with the cold coming up through the boards under his bare feet, that it wasn't only that. The house without her in it sounded different, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. No tags clinking against a water bowl down the hall, no soft thump of a body settling onto a rug. He thought about the intake folder Priya had read from, the words bolted and unstable, and about the way Juno's chin had rested on his foot that morning, like a hand laid deliberately over a wound. He thought about 11 years of people deciding, on his behalf, what his own senses were and weren't allowed to mean. He thought, standing on the step, about going after her. He didn't, not that night. He stood at the edge of the porch, cane in one hand, the other braced on the rail, and let the sound of her claws fade all the way out into silence before he went back inside, and even then some part of him stayed on that step long after his body had gone in. The rain came sometime after midnight, he thought, though he couldn't be sure how much of that was the smell in the air and how much was memory borrowing from other nights like it. Somewhere around 3, the back latch clicked again, soft as a held breath, and Juno's weight settled onto the rug beside his bed without a sound, her fur carrying in the cold, wet scent of a night spent standing still outdoors. 19 nights out of the last 21, he would learn from Priya's file the next week, though he didn't need the number to know it. 19 nights out of 21, something in this town had pulled a decorated K9 out of a warm house and sent her walking, alone, to stand at the same corner until she was satisfied whatever she was standing guard over could be left again until tomorrow. he thought, lying there, of the 40 minutes themselves, a held breath, the length of an entire shift he could feel in his own chest, and wondered how long a person could hold something like that before it stopped being duty and simply became love. Abel lay awake a long time that night, listening to her breathe, wondering what a dog could possibly be keeping watch over that no one else in this town seemed able to name. He thought of the folder Priya carried, thick with clean-typed judgments about a creature who could not defend herself in the only language the county recognized. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathe, slow, even, unbothered by any of it, until his own anger on her behalf finally slowed to match it. The next night, Abel went with her. He didn't announce it, not even to himself, until his hand was already on the harness clip. Juno stood by the door at 3 minutes to 9. She seemed to keep the time somewhere inside her that had nothing to do with clocks, and when Abel reached for the leash, instead of letting her go alone, she didn't pull away. She waited, patient in a way that felt, to him, like permission. He walked with the leash looped through his left hand and his cane sweeping in its familiar low arc in his right, and for the first time in 11 years, Abel Ferris was the one leading the walk, even though he could not have named a single landmark on the route. He learned the ground of it instead. 2 shallow dips in the sidewalk where tree roots had pushed the concrete up and settled it crooked again. A manhole cover on the 3rd block that rang a half-tone lower than the ones before it, hollow in a way that told him the space beneath it was larger. A patch of warm air still rising off a bakery's back vent, sugar and scorched flour, gone as quickly as it came, a dog barking twice behind a fence, then falling silent as if it recognized the sound of Juno's paws and decided there was nothing worth the effort. The low mechanical hum of a laundromat's cooling unit at the corner where Juno finally slowed and then stopped. She didn't sit, she didn't lie down the way a tired dog lies down. She stood, weight settled evenly on all 4 legs, ears forward, at a fixed point on the sidewalk that Abel could locate by nothing more than the particular echo his cane threw back off a mailbox to his left and a low brick wall somewhere ahead. He stood with her. He listened to the wind change direction twice, felt it swing from behind him to full in his face and back again. He counted, without meaning to at first, and then very deliberately once he realized what he was counting. 40 minutes. She stood at that spot for 40 minutes, the length, he would learn, of a standard night patrol shift, before she turned and started for home on her own, the leash going loose and easy in his hand the moment her purpose for the evening was done. There was no hesitation in the turn, no sniffing back over her shoulder the way a dog checks whether it's allowed to leave a thing behind. She simply finished, the way a person finishes a task they've done 10,000 times, and started walking, and Abel followed a half-step behind her instead of leading, because for those first few strides home, it felt right to let her decide when the shift was truly over. He asked the man who ran the all-night newsstand 2 doors down, the next morning, whether he knew anything about that corner. The man didn't hesitate. And Abel heard, in the easy certainty of his answer, that this was a story the whole block already knew and had simply stopped telling out loud. "That's where the officer died," he said, 2 years back now. Sergeant, they said his name was, Farrow, right on that spot, middle of his shift. Nobody found him for near an hour. The newsstand man's voice dropped a register on the word found, the way voices do around a fact people have decided not to dwell on, out of respect, or out of unease, or both. Abel stood very still in the doorway of the newsstand, with a folded newspaper he couldn't read pressed against his chest, and something in him rearranged itself, quietly, the way furniture in a familiar room rearranges itself in memory long before you notice it's moved. Juno wasn't wandering. Juno was working a post. Every night, on her own schedule, at her own fixed hour, she was standing guard at the exact place where the man who trained her had died, holding a shift that had never, as far as she seemed to understand it, been officially closed. 11 years of being told his instincts couldn't be trusted, and here was a dog whose entire life since her partner's death had been an instinct nobody else had bothered to translate. Abel thought about the folder Priya carried, the clean-typed words bolted and unstable, and felt something close to anger on Juno's behalf. Not loud anger, the quieter kind that comes from recognizing your own condition in someone else's. That night, back in his kitchen, Abel did something he hadn't done since the anchor first played the tape. He recorded himself. He spoke the 12 words of the call into his phone, slow, and then again, trying each time to hear past his own voice into the shape the original speaker's breath had made around them. He tried the sentence broken one way, then another, chasing something he couldn't yet name, his own voice sounding strange to him, played back, thinner than it felt in his throat, almost like listening to a stranger try on his own words. On the 4th try, he found it. "He's down at the corner of Bell and 9th. He's not moving. Send somebody." The break wasn't where a man standing over a dying friend would put it. A man like that speaks in one long ragged rush, the sentence tumbling out ahead of his own breath, because his breath can't keep pace with his fear. This voice broke after the 3rd word of each line. "He's down at, he's not moving. Send somebody," clean, even pauses, the rhythm of someone reading something they had already composed, not someone watching a body on the pavement in front of them. Wendell Cole had not spoken those words that way. Abel was certain of it in a way he could not yet defend to anyone but himself. He thought of every voice he had ever had to trust blind. Voices in briefing tents, voices over a field radio with the line cutting in and out, voices telling him where the next step was safe to put his foot, and knew, the way he knew those, that this was a man reading, not a man watching someone die. He had learned, out of necessity, to hear the difference between a person telling him the truth under pressure and a person managing him, and this recording sat, unmistakably, in the 2nd category. He called the lawyer who had handled Wendell's case 2 years ago, got a machine, and left a message asking for 10 minutes of the man's time. Then he sat in his kitchen with Juno's head heavy against his knee and said the thing out loud for the first time, to no one, the way he'd said the thing about the breath 3 weeks before. "I know it isn't him," he said. "I heard it." The lawyer called back 2 days later and agreed to see him, but not without a condition that landed in Abel's stomach like a stone. "Bring whatever you can hold in your hand," the lawyer said, "something I can put on a table." Abel sat with the phone still warm against his ear, long after the call had ended. He had nothing he could hold. He had a half-breath, a broken rhythm, and a dog who stood guard over a dead man's post. None of it weighed anything at all, and yet all of it sat in his chest with the exact solid weight of something true, heavier, in its way, than anything he could have carried in his hand. He sat a long while with that thought. Then he rose. Juno stirred at the sound of his chair and rose with him, and the two of them stood together in the dark kitchen, neither one of them anything close to enough on paper, and both of them, somehow, still standing. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and the sharp bite of printer toner, a smell Abel associated, fairly or not, with rooms where things got decided without him. He laid it out the way he'd rehearsed it, the half-breath, the broken rhythm of the 3 sentences, the 40 minutes Juno held her post at the corner of Bell and 9th, night after night, like a shift that had never been relieved. He spoke without interruption, and he was careful, methodical, the way he'd once briefed officers before a patrol, laying each piece down in order so nothing could be mistaken for guesswork. The chair beneath him creaked once when he leaned forward to make his point about the newsstand man's account, and he was aware, the whole time, of how thin all of it sounded laid end to end in a room built for paper and signatures. The lawyer let him finish the whole of it, sat through it, without once reaching for his phone. He only clicked his pen 3 times, slow, the way a man does when he's deciding how to say something he'd rather not say at all. Then he read Abel one line from a file on his desk, and the room changed shape around it. In this case, Abel's own case, the same courtroom, the same judge who would hear any new motion Abel might bring. A voice identification claim from a blind witness had already been raised once, 2 years earlier, from a neighbor who lived near the corner and swore he recognized something wrong in the recording. That judge had thrown it out at the preliminary hearing, without letting it reach a jury. Not because the neighbor was lying. Because the court had already ruled once in this very case that testimony built on sound alone from someone who could not see the speaker wasn't admissible as identification. "I'm not telling you you're wrong," the lawyer said, and that was somehow worse than if he had. I'm telling you, this exact door has already been shut once, in this exact courtroom, and a judge doesn't like reopening a door he's already closed. Everything Abel had assembled over the last 2 weeks was still true. It was simply, as far as this courtroom was concerned, useless. The one instrument he had more of than anyone else, his ears, was precisely the instrument the system had already ruled unreliable. He thought of 11 years of being told, gently, that he couldn't possibly know what he knew, and understood now that somewhere along the way, a courtroom had said the same thing out loud and put it into law. It wasn't cruelty. That was the part that made it hard to argue with. It was a rule, applied evenly, that simply happened to erase him. He asked, quietly, whether there was any other way in, an expert witness, a fresh motion, anything. The lawyer's answer was gentle and complete in its refusal, not without something else standing beside it, not on his ears alone. Not twice, in front of the same judge. Abel sat a moment longer than he needed to before he stood, running his thumb once along the edge of the desk to find his bearings, and thanked the man for his time in a voice that came out steadier than he felt. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, and he understood, walking toward the door, that the lawyer's kindness in the telling didn't change the shape of the answer at all. He walked into the hallway afterward and stood a long time with one hand flat against the cool plaster wall, counting the elevator's arrivals by the small chime it made, because counting something, anything, was easier than standing still with what he'd just been told. The hallway had a high ceiling and a stone floor, and every sound in it came back, changed, stretched thin and hollow, so that even his own breathing seemed to belong to the size of the room and not to him. He understood, standing there, exactly how large the thing was that had just told him no. Somewhere below, a set of doors opened and closed, the ordinary traffic of people whose business here had nothing to do with him, and Abel found, oddly, that the sound of other lives moving forward around his own stillness was the hardest part of the whole morning. He went to Maddie Cole's house anyway. He hadn't planned to. His feet simply carried him there, the way Juno's carried her to a corner every night, regardless of what the paperwork said about it. The porch boards under his cane felt newer than the rest of the house, recently replaced, and he wondered, walking up them, whether she'd fixed them herself or whether Prescott had sent someone. Maddie opened the door on the second knock. He got 3 sentences out, the breath, the rhythm, the 40 minutes, before she said she was sorry and closed the door, gently. A soft click of a latch settling home, quieter than a slam, and somehow that quiet did more damage. He stood on her steps a moment before he understood why the door closing softly had hurt worse than if she'd shouted. A slammed door would have told him she still had a fight in her. This one only told him she'd already used it up. He learned later, though not that day, that Maddie had signed the papers accepting her brother's plea, in part because she was simply out of strength to keep believing there was another version of events worth chasing. She wasn't refusing Abel because she thought he was wrong. She was refusing him because she couldn't survive hoping again and being wrong about it. He understood that kind of exhaustion. He had lived beside a version of it himself for 11 years, the particular tiredness of a person who has run out of ways to defend what they know to be true, who has learned that hope costs something every single time it fails, and that some months you simply can't afford to spend it again. He thought, standing there on her steps with the door already closed, of the many small kindnesses Prescott had shown him over the same stretch of weeks, and wondered, not for the first time, whether kindness offered without being asked for was always as simple as it looked. He walked home the long way that afternoon, letting Juno set the pace, in no hurry to arrive anywhere that had a phone in it. The town went about its ordinary business around him, a delivery truck idling somewhere off to his right, 2 women laughing on a bench he passed, the clatter of a hardware store's door propped open with a bell above it, and none of it, he thought, had the slightest idea what had just happened inside a courthouse 2 blocks away. At home that night, Abel did a small, human thing that he would later be unable to fully explain even to himself. He deleted the recording, his own voice, reading the 12 seconds back to himself, testing the breaks in the sentence. He sat afterward in the dark kitchen with his hands on the table, empty of everything he'd built the last 2 weeks around, listening to the house settle the way houses do at night, ticking and shifting, indifferent to what had just happened inside it. He thought, briefly and without much conviction, that maybe the lawyer was right, that maybe 11 years of being told his senses couldn't be trusted had simply, finally, been proven correct by people whose job it was to decide such things. Juno did not go out on post that night. 9 o'clock came and went, and instead of the click of the back latch, Abel felt her weight settle down against the door itself, blocking it, her body between him and the night outside. He hadn't asked her to stay. He understood, sitting there with his hand eventually finding the warm slope of her back, that she had made that decision on her own, the way she made all her decisions, by reading something in the room that no file had ever managed to capture. Her breathing was slower than usual, deliberate, as if she too had decided that tonight called for something other than the corner of Bell and 9th. The phone rang a little after 10. Abel let it ring twice before he answered. It was Priya Nakamura, and her voice had the same flat, decided quality it had carried the first day she came to his door, except now there was no question in it at all. She was coming in the morning, she said, to take Juno back. Priya arrived at 8 the next morning with a folder under one arm and a transport crate in the other, and Abel heard, in the particular careful way she set the crate down on his porch instead of just dropping it, that some part of her didn't want to be doing this. The crate's door swung once on its hinge and settled with a small metallic click, and Abel found he could not stop his mind from measuring the sound of it, the way he measured everything now, as if the world had become a series of small sounds he had to catalog before he could bear to think about what they meant. "One thing," Abel said, before she could start. "Give me one more night. Come with me. Watch her yourself, with your own instruments, not mine. If I'm wrong, take her in the morning, and I won't call again." He heard the folder shift in her hands, heard her weigh it, and after a long moment she agreed, not because his voice moved her, he suspected, but because a woman who dealt in evidence for a living couldn't easily refuse an offer to gather more of it. She set a condition of her own. She would bring her own notes, her own timing, and whatever she found would stand regardless of what Abel wanted it to say. He told her that was exactly what he wanted from her. She was quiet a moment longer, as if surprised by how easily he'd agreed to be judged on her terms instead of his own. That night, the three of them stood at the corner of Bell and 9th, Abel, Priya, and Juno, fixed in her post between them, and Priya ran a stopwatch instead of a stethoscope over what Abel had already learned by feel. 40 minutes, give or take three nights running by the neighbor's own diary entries she'd gathered that afternoon. Abel didn't need her stopwatch to know it. He measured it his own way, the only way he had. Each night, Juno rose from her post at the exact moment the last city bus made its second pass on its loop, and at the exact moment the cold began to gather, damp and metallic, on the iron handrail beside them. The number was Priya's, ticked off on her stopwatch. The pattern was Abel's, built from familiar sounds folding back on themselves, night after night, too precise to be chance. "An unstable dog doesn't keep a schedule," Abel said, quietly, into the dark. That was the moment, more than any argument he had made in a lawyer's office or on a stranger's front steps, that the word dangerous began, for the first time, to crack open in front of a person whose job it was to use it. He heard Priya's pen stop moving against her notepad, heard the small intake of breath that meant she had just written something down that contradicted what she'd come there expecting to write. They stood together a long while after Juno finally turned for home, neither of them speaking, the cold settling deeper into the evening, and Abel found himself, for the first time since the broadcast, standing beside someone who wasn't trying to manage him, or dismiss him, or gently steer him back toward what he was supposed to already know he couldn't trust. He listened to Priya's breathing change too, over those 40 minutes, the way it does in anyone slowly letting go of a conclusion they'd been carrying a long time. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged twice, and a car passed with its radio low, and neither of them moved until Juno herself decided the watch was over. Priya read the intake file aloud to him in the car afterward, headlights off, the heater ticking as it cooled, the smell of stale coffee from a cup wedged in the console between them. Every line in it was technically true and somehow entirely wrong about what it described, bolted from her post. Damaged door hardware, as if a dog keeping a promise no one had asked her to keep, was the same thing as a dog out of control. Priya's voice, reading it back now, had none of the flat certainty it carried the first day in Abel's kitchen. It had the sound of someone rereading her own handwriting and not recognizing the person who wrote it. Then, without Abel asking, Priya told him why she read files that way in the first place. Years ago, she said, she had matched a dog to a family without reading closely enough between those same clean technical lines, and something had gone wrong, badly enough that the program itself had nearly been shut down over it. She had spent every placement since then, terrified of being the reason it happened twice. She wasn't cold, she said. She was frightened, and frightened people write rules that don't leave room for exceptions. Her voice, telling it, had the careful evenness of someone who had rehearsed the confession in her head many times and never once said it out loud to another person. Abel didn't press for more of it. He recognized, in the shape of what she'd just given him, exactly how much it had cost to say even that much, and he sat with the silence that followed the way he'd learned to sit with any silence that mattered, without trying to fill it. He thought, listening to her, that fear dressed up as a rule was still fear, and that he had spent 11 years living on the other side of exactly that kind of rule, without anyone ever admitting what it really was. She didn't reclaim Juno that night. She didn't clear her file either. She gave Abel 7 days, not a pardon, only a postponement, a small window propped open instead of a door shut, and told him plainly that if nothing changed by the end of it, she wouldn't have the authority to hold the line for him a second time. 7 days, she repeated, as if saying the number twice might make it feel longer than it did. Abel thanked her, and meant it, though the number sat in his chest with the particular weight of a countdown he had no way to slow. Before that, though, while the crate still sat empty on the porch where she'd left it, Priya crouched down to Juno's level for a long moment, running a hand once along the dog's flank, and said nothing at all, the kind of silence, Abel thought, that a person only offers an animal they have already, quietly, stopped being afraid of. When she stood again, her voice had lost the last of its official edge entirely, and what remained sounded, for the first time since she'd walked into his life with a folder under her arm, like a woman speaking simply as herself. She sat behind the wheel a moment without starting the engine, and Abel heard, in that small hesitation, a woman deciding whether to say something else before the night closed over it entirely. Just before she pulled out of his driveway, Priya said one more thing, quiet, almost to herself rather than to him, the words coming out the way a confession comes out of someone who hadn't planned on making one. "The night Pharaoh died," she said, "I was on shift too, different building." Then she said nothing else. Abel sat with that silence a long moment after her car had gone, turning it over, understanding that Priya had just come close to something she had never let herself look at directly before, and that whatever it wasn't finished being said. He stood in the cold driveway a while longer than he needed to, listening to the tail end of her engine fade down the street, before he finally went in. Juno's leash still looped loose around his wrist, forgotten there since the corner. The house phone rang again close to midnight. Prescott's voice came through, gentle as always, wrapped around something that didn't sound gentle at all once Abel listened past the tone of it. "I heard you've been walking at night," Prescott said. "That's not safe for a man in your position." Abel said nothing back for a moment, only listened to the particular ease with which Prescott had said the word walking, not out for air, not taking the dog out, walking. As if he already knew exactly where those walks led, and exactly who Abel had been standing with at the corner of Bell and 9th. He thought of every ride to the market, every letter read aloud a beat too slow in the wrong place, and felt, for the first time, the cold, deliberate shape of something underneath all that kindness that he had no proof of yet, and no name for. He said goodnight, evenly, and set the phone down with a hand that was not quite as steady as he wanted it to be. He sat a long while afterward in the dark, listening to the house and to Juno's breathing beside him. The tape no longer frightened him. The man on the phone did. 2 years before any of this, on a night that had nothing to do with Abel Ferris, Priya Nakamura had been 26 years old and 3 months into a records clerkship she'd taken because it paid better than dispatch. She remembered the basement of the county building, the way people remember the rooms where something in their life quietly turned, fluorescent light with a faint green cast, buzzing at a pitch just below hearing. Rows of steel shelving holding decades of magnetic tape in plastic cases gone brittle and yellow at the edges, each one labeled in a clerk's careful handwriting that predated the digital system by a generation. The building's policy, unglamorous and almost forgotten, was that every emergency call was captured twice, once into the modern system that fed the newsrooms and the courtrooms, and once onto the original tape reel, sealed and shelved in that basement archive, kept for 7 years by a state record statute nobody upstairs ever thought about. She remembered signing the sign-out log for a colleague that night, initialing a line she barely glanced at, because a favor between coworkers wasn't the kind of thing you thought twice about. She remembered the smell of the place, dust and old adhesive, and the metallic tang of magnetic tape stored too long in a room that ran a few degrees too warm. She remembered the sound the shelving made when a case was slid free, a low scrape of metal on metal that echoed longer than it should have in a room that size. She remembered, too, how ordinary it had all felt, how a night that would matter this much, 2 years later, had passed her by at the time like any other shift, filed and forgotten before she'd even clocked out. She had not thought about that basement in 2 years. She was thinking about it now, sitting at Abel's kitchen table, the memory arriving in her, all at once and whole, the basement door swinging open in her mind before she decided to open it. "There are 2 copies of every call," she said, and Abel heard her voice change register slightly, the way a person's voice changes when they are telling you something they've only just finished admitting to themselves. "The version that goes out to the news, to the courts, that's the digital feed, but the original still exists, on tape, separate system, separate room." Abel sat very still, one hand around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm without his noticing. The refrigerator in the next room clicked into its cycle and hummed, and in the space that hum opened up, something in Abel's chest that had been cold since the morning of the news broadcast finally had a name to attach itself to. The version the whole town had heard, over and over, on every screen in every living room, that was the digital copy. Which meant it had passed, at some point, through someone's hands. Someone had touched it before it reached the air. Abel turned the thought over slowly, the way he turned over anything heavy enough to require both hands. 2 years he had assumed, along with everyone else, that what the town heard was simply what had happened. It had never occurred to him, until this moment, that a recording could be edited the same way a story could, not by changing the words, but by choosing which version of a voice got to survive. Someone could have spliced in an answer that was never given that night, a calm, practiced reply, dubbed over the silence where a real one should have been, and no one listening at home would ever have known the difference. "Who signed the log the night Pharaoh died?" Abel asked. He listened for whatever nervousness might be in Priya's answer, and heard, instead, resolve settling into her voice, the sound of a person who has just decided to stop protecting a system and start protecting a person instead. She said she'd find out. She said she still had contacts and records, that she could request access to the archive under the rehoming program's authority, official enough not to raise questions, quiet enough not to warn anyone off. Her chair scraped back from the table as she stood, already reaching for her coat, the sudden decisiveness of someone who has spent 2 years circling a question and finally has a direction to run it down. She paused at the door a moment, one hand on the frame, and said something Abel would turn over long after she'd gone, that she had told herself all this time that keeping careful rules was the same thing as keeping people safe. She wasn't sure anymore that those were the same thing at all. She said it quietly, almost as an apology, and Abel understood that it was meant for more than just Juno. He heard the door close behind her a moment later, softer than he expected from someone in such a hurry. For a long stretch after she left, Abel sat alone at the table with the tea gone fully cold, turning over a sound he had carried with him without understanding for weeks, a sound buried just beneath the words "send somebody" on the broadcast tape, so faint most listeners would never separate it from static, a short double tone. 2 notes, clipped and mechanical, the kind of chirp mounted only on dispatch fleet vehicles. It sat just under the second half of the line. He's down at the corner of Bell and 9th. He's not moving. Send somebody. Buried so deep beneath the words that a hearing person would need to be told to find it at all. He had heard that same tone before, years ago, standing near a motor pool overseas, radios idling in a row of parked vehicles, and it had simply never occurred to him, until tonight, that he had been hearing it all along underneath a stranger's borrowed voice. A man standing alone on a street corner at night, calling in an emergency from wherever he happened to be, would have no reason to have that sound behind him. A man sitting inside a dispatch room, at a console, with a fleet radio idling somewhere nearby, he would. The thought settled into him slowly, the way cold settles into a room through a door left open too long, until it had filled every corner of what he'd believed for 2 weeks. He sat with it a long while, running the sound back and forth in his memory, checking it the way he checked everything now, twice, 3 times, before he let himself trust it. He thought, too, of how easily a whole town had accepted the version they'd been given, simply because it had arrived on every screen at once, in the same authoritative cadence the news always used, whether the story underneath it was true or not. Nobody had thought to ask whether a broadcast could lie by omission, by playing only the copy that had already passed through the right pair of hands. He counted, without meaning to, the nights left on Priya's clock. 3 days gone already since she'd given him the week. 4 remained. He sat with that number the way he sat with everything now, turning it in his mind like a stone in his pocket, worn smooth from handling. Juno lay across the kitchen doorway, not asleep, her ears occasionally shifting toward some sound in the house too small for Abel to place, and he found himself grateful, in that quiet stretch, for a companion who never once asked him to explain what he was thinking. He thought, too, about the way Juno had walked straight to that basement corridor weeks from now without ever having set foot in the building, as if grief itself left a scent a trained animal could follow long after the person who caused it had tried to bury the trail. It was not evidence a courtroom would accept. It was, he was beginning to understand, exactly the kind of evidence a courtroom had never learned how to read. The phone rang half an hour later. Priya's voice this time carried none of the resolve from an hour before. It carried something closer to alarm, tight and fast. The request to access the tape archive had already been logged once this week, ahead of hers, a destruction order, not a research request, routine disposal of an old tape lot, scheduled and signed for approval Friday morning. Today was Thursday. The archive building's basement was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season, dry and faintly metallic, dust and old adhesive layered under the clean chemical bite of tape stock. The clerk who should have been at the front desk had already gone home for the evening, and the paperwork Priya carried wasn't, strictly, enough on its own to get them past a locked door, so they went in through the side entrance instead, down a flight of stairs that gave off a low institutional hum with every step, the sound bouncing off concrete in a way that made the stairwell feel far longer than it was. Abel's phone rang halfway across the first hallway, and when he answered it he heard, at first, only Maddie's breathing, close and unsteady, before he understood the call had connected by accident. Her phone still lived in her pocket, while another conversation happened somewhere near her. He heard Prescott's voice on the far side of it, not threatening, not raised, but soft, consoling, the voice of a man offering comfort instead of pressure, which was somehow worse. "Sign it and it's over," Prescott was saying, "for both of you." Abel heard a pen roll once across a wooden surface, heard it picked back up, heard a paper slide forward. He stood in a basement hallway 2 miles away, with a phone pressed to his ear, unable to do a single thing but listen, his free hand curling slowly into a fist at his side, useless against a conversation happening somewhere he couldn't reach. He stayed on the line long after the call should have logically ended, unwilling to be the one who let it go, as if hanging up might somehow hand Prescott the room faster. Maddie's reply came in a text 10 minutes later, one line, sent to Abel directly. "I haven't signed. I remembered what you said on my steps." Abel read it twice through the phone's speaking function, the flat mechanical voice reading Maddie's words back to him in a cadence that had nothing to do with her own, and still the words landed the same, the sound of a woman finding, at the very last possible moment, one more reason to hold the line a while longer. Every kindness Prescott had ever shown Abel rearranged itself in that moment into something else entirely: the rides to the market, the mail read aloud, the offer to handle the paperwork. What Abel had mistaken for care all these weeks had simply been surveillance, patient and well-dressed, waiting for him to stop noticing the difference. He thought of the question Prescott had asked him the very first morning, so lightly folded into small talk he'd nearly missed it. "You were listening to that broadcast this morning?" He understood now, standing in a basement 2 miles from that kitchen table, exactly why the question had been asked at all. Every gentle thing the man had ever said to him, Abel realized, had been a way of taking his temperature. Down in the stacks, Abel read the building the only way he could. A ventilation fan cycling every 30 seconds, footsteps somewhere far off echoing flat off a low concrete ceiling, and Juno pulling steady and sure ahead of him on the leash, moving with the same confident certainty she carried to the corner of Bell and 9th every night, as if this ground too was ground she already knew by heart. She stopped. She stood, the same fixed posture she held every night at the corner of Bell and 9th. She didn't sniff at anything, didn't nose along the shelving the way a searching dog would. She simply arrived and waited, the way a soldier arrives and waits at a post already assigned to her. Priya, reading the shelf tag beside her, went quiet for a long moment before she said it out loud. This was the exact aisle where Pharaoh used to sign in the tapes at shift change, and Juno had stood beside him at that spot, every rotation for years. Abel felt the small hairs rise on his arms, not from the cold, at the thought of a dog who had carried a map of grief precisely enough to walk them straight to it, unprompted, unrewarded, for 2 years running, long after everyone else had stopped believing there was anything left to find here. The reel itself was still in its case, sealed inside a numbered lot box, cross-logged with 2 signatures required for release, which meant Prescott hadn't been able to simply pull it and walk out. A missing single tape would show up instantly against the ledger, with his name attached to the gap. That was why he needed the whole lot condemned instead, so that one tape's disappearance would vanish inside the paperwork of 100 others, no name required. Priya signed the lot out properly, her name on the line, and the log recorded it clean, the pen scratching loud in the quiet room. The building kept one working tape reader, an old machine that hummed and clicked when Priya switched it on, and her authorization was good for that too. They fed the original reel through it there in the archive room and let it run, and Abel held his phone up to the small speaker and recorded what came out of it, standing so still that he could feel his own pulse in his ears over the low static of the tape spooling forward. The reel turned with a soft, uneven rhythm, decades of storage giving it a faint warp Abel could hear in the pitch, and beneath it, unmistakable now that he was listening for it directly instead of through memory, the double chirp he'd carried in his chest for weeks. What he carried out of that basement an hour later wasn't the tape itself. It was a phone recording of the tape, his own phone, in his own coat pocket, the only proof of the original that existed anywhere outside that sealed shelf. Prescott called one last time as they climbed the stairs back out, and for the first time since Abel had known him, something in his voice slipped entirely out of its gentle register. "You don't know what you're holding," he said. "No," Abel answered, "but I know who's breathing on it." Tonight made 4 nights since Priya's clock started, and even as they walked out into the cold, Juno left his side again, unbidden, the way she had every night this week, one more night subtracted from whatever grace Priya had left to give. Abel let her go this time, without following, standing on the sidewalk outside the archive building and listening to her claws fade down the block toward the corner she still, after everything, refused to abandon. By the time they reached the sidewalk, the shape of the next morning had already settled between the three of them, without a word spoken. 9 o'clock, Priya said, a local reporter she trusted, and enough people passing through the plaza in front of the town hall that nothing said there could be quietly taken back. Abel sent one line to Maddie, the hour, the place. Nothing more was needed. He stood a moment on the cold sidewalk after sending it, phone still warm in his hand, feeling for the first time in 2 weeks that the ground under his feet had a direction to it again. The recording sat small and impossibly light in Abel's coat pocket, and the destruction order for the tape it had come from was still, as far as anyone downtown knew, set to take effect at 9 the next morning. Priya asked him, quietly, what he planned to do with what he was carrying. She waited a moment for him to say more, and when he didn't, she simply started the car, and the two of them rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt, for the first time in weeks, like the good kind. Abel told her he didn't need a courtroom for it. He only needed a speaker and a crowd. He said it a second time, quieter, almost to himself this time rather than to her, as if testing whether the plan sounded as solid-spoken twice as it had the first time, and found that it did, that somewhere between the basement stairs and this cold sidewalk, the plan had stopped being a hope and become, simply, the next thing he was going to do. He said it plainly, without any of the heat the words might have carried in another man's mouth, and Priya didn't argue. She only nodded, a gesture Abel couldn't see but understood anyway, in the small settling silence that followed, the quiet of someone who has decided, finally, to stand where she's told him she'll stand. Before she drove off, she pressed a small clip-on speaker into his hand, the kind she used for playing evidence recordings aloud in meetings, and told him to keep it. He walked home that last stretch alone, Juno already gone ahead toward her corner, the speaker clipped now to his coat pocket, and let himself, just once, imagine what it might feel like to be believed by strangers in daylight instead of only by a dog in the dark. Friday morning, the people gathered on the steps of the town hall would tell it differently depending on where they'd been standing, but they would all agree on one thing afterward. Nobody in that crowd expected to be watching a man's face fall apart in real time. A woman waiting for the records office to open later said she noticed the blind man first because he moved through the small crowd with a confidence that didn't match the cane in his hand, steady, unhesitating, the dog beside him walking not like a guide but like an escort. Behind him came the county's rehoming coordinator, and off to one side, half hidden near the flagpole as if she hadn't fully decided to be there, a woman a few people recognized as Wendell Cole's sister. Rowan Prescott stood near the front steps in his usual unhurried way, hands in his coat pockets, nodding at a councilman he knew. Two clerks from the records office paused on their way in, curious about the small commotion. Nobody thought, in that first moment, that anything about the morning was unusual at all. Abel didn't raise his voice. He unclipped the small speaker Priya had given him, held his phone close to it, and said only, "Same call, 2 copies, listen to the breath," and pressed play. The broadcast version came first, the one the whole town had heard 100 times by now, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakable. Then, a half-second later, the second recording began underneath it, the one pulled from a sealed reel in a basement archive the night before, and the two versions ran together, not quite in step, close enough that anyone listening could hear where they broke apart. "He's down at the corner of Bell and 9th. He's not moving. Send somebody." Rowan Prescott's face changed before anyone standing near him understood why. The people closest to him would describe it later as watching color drain out of a man in real time, the muscles around his mouth going slack a full second before anything came out of it. And then, low, almost too fast to register as a decision at all, his own voice answered the recording, not shock, not denial, but reflex, the exact clipped cadence of a man who has said the line 1,000 times across a dispatch console and whose body knew the words before his mind could stop them. "Stay on the line, units on the way." It was the answer of a dispatcher taking a call, not a bystander reacting to one, and the archived reel, underneath the broadcast version, held no such answer at all, only silence where a response should have been, because the console had sat unmanned that whole shift, while its dispatcher stood somewhere else. Every person standing close enough to hear understood it in the same instant, without anyone needing to explain it to them. The calm voice the whole town had heard for 2 years, the one that made the broadcast sound like a call properly handled, had never been recorded that night at all. It had been recorded after, in this same voice, and laid quietly over the silence. The crowd went still, one person after another, spreading outward from where Prescott stood, each new silence rearranging what they thought they knew about a case that had been closed for 2 years. Then the dog moved. Juno rose from where she had been sitting quietly at Abel's side, and the small crowd, already tense, seemed to brace for something. Teeth, a lunge. The thing everyone half expected from a dog whose file carried the word dangerous. She did none of it. She simply stood, turned, and walked a slow, deliberate half-circle around the edge of the gathered people, past the flagpole, past the councilman, and came to a stop directly in front of Abel, and then she lay down. She had held a post at the corner of Bell and 9th for 2 years, every night, without anyone asking her to, and without anyone able to explain why. Standing there on the town hall steps, more than one person in that crowd understood, all at once, what they were watching. A shift that had never been formally closed, closing now, in front of witnesses. She had been keeping watch for a man who could no longer come back to relieve her. Now, finally, someone had. In the same breath that Juno settled to the ground, Maddie Cole stepped out from beside the flagpole, into the open space at the front of the crowd, her voice carrying farther than anyone expected from someone who had spent 2 years staying quiet. She said she hadn't signed the papers. She said she wasn't going to. 2 things happened in the same instant, in the same small patch of morning light: a woman who had surrendered finding her feet again, and a dog who had never once stopped standing guard, finally allowed herself to stop. Abel didn't see any of it. He couldn't have described the color leaving Prescott's face, or the careful half-circle Juno walked around the crowd, or the exact moment Maddie's voice broke through the silence. What reached him instead was the crowd's noise falling away in layers, outside in, until the plaza held nothing but held breath. And then, low against his foot, familiar as morning, the warm weight of a dog's head settling down exactly where it had rested 3 weeks before, on a quiet morning in his own kitchen, before any of this had a name. A voice he didn't recognize broke away from the crowd and moved toward him, close enough now that he could hear the breath before the words. It asked him a single question. He never got the chance to answer it. The crowd's noise rose back up around him in a wave, warm and unfamiliar, and beneath it, low against his foot, Juno's weight pressed once against his leg and stayed. Wendell Cole's case was reopened within the week. Maddie withdrew her signature for good, and the 7 days Priya had once given Abel simply ran out, unused, because there was nothing left for anyone to reclaim. She closed Juno's file herself, in 3 words: on duty, relieved. That night, 9 o'clock came and went, and Juno didn't move for the back door at all. She lay down instead, beside his chair, and stayed. It was on the porch, some weeks later, that someone finally sat down beside him and asked the question the voice in the crowd never got the chance to finish. "What did you hear?" Abel told it slowly, the half-breath, the way it sat just ahead of a rehearsed line, the way people breathe differently when they've already decided what they're about to say. He wasn't used to being asked to explain it. He was even less used to what came after, quiet, all the way to the end. The porch chair creaked once, taking someone's weight, the boards holding the day's last warmth. At 9 o'clock, out of 11 years of habit, he listened for the click of claws toward the back door. There was none. Just a dog, breathing slow and even, already home.